Welcome to the Weaver Sews. I'm Daryl Lancaster. This video is part of a series explaining how to create using leftover scraps. The leftover scraps can be from anything you have: hand-woven bits, leftover commercial fabrics, quilt fabrics, wools, linens, silks, even leather scraps. One of the best parts of this process for me is to pick all of the things that I might want to use for this masterpiece. Here are some of the things that I laid out on my table that went into this pieced vest. Not only were there generous scraps of hand-woven cotton left over from this coat, but I had some silks and leather scraps as well. Mats are great places to use really small amounts of anything you have. If you're a quilter, fat quarters are perfect. Combine them with hand-woven fabric and you have a winner. I don't have many rules here. Fabrics can't be too thick because they have to be able to be fused to a backing. I like to keep my elements close to the same thickness, but then again, there's always room for exception. This is a fine silk jacquard, which I interfaced first next to a piece of leather scrap, and you can see how thick that leather is. Start small, just to familiarize yourself with the technique. For the mat, I start with a base of Peltex 71, which is a one-sided fusible heavyweight interfacing. The mat template is 13 inches by 17 inches, or 33 by 43 centimeters. Measure in 2 inches or 5 centimeters from each corner, both horizontally and vertically, and cut off each corner diagonally. With thicker bases, like the Peltex, the base is cut to the exact dimensions of the finished project. When you are cutting a fusible base for a garment, in the case of fusing it, cut the pieces from the pattern sections, but include an extra 1/2 inch to 5/8 inch or 1.2 to 1.5 centimeters all the way around, unless there is a fold. Once all the piecing is complete, we will recut to the original pattern dimensions. This gives us wiggle room. When I'm working with a stiff base, like the mat, I can easily carry my composition of scraps over to the ironing board. But I can't really do that with the fusing knit. And trust me, you don't want to try to carry this whole thing to the ironing board without support. When I'm working on a fusing knit base, I build the sections on a cardboard cutting board, folded to a convenient width, allowing me to pin into it easily to hold things in place. Fusing can be done with everything still attached to the cardboard cutting board. We'll touch more on fusing later in the video. This next step is purely optional. There are those who love to just use the scrap as it comes out of the pile, fitting things together with no regard for grain, happily creating with abandon. Others of us suffer from what I call blank paper syndrome, which means, and I see this all the time in classes, I don't even know how or where to begin. I'm an organized sort of person, can't you tell, and suffer greatly from blank paper syndrome. I find that creating a series of grid lines on the base to be really helpful in knowing where to start. The grid can be horizontal and vertical, or diagonal, or both. I like the lines to have some reference to the grain line of the finished project, whether it is a garment, a mat, a tote, or whatever. In the case of the mat, fusible side up, I've drawn a 3-inch or 7.6 centimeter grid on the diagonal with a blue colored pencil. I picked 3 inches because that's the width of my ruler. This doesn't mean that you have to make a bunch of 3-inch squares. It means you have a rough guide for placing the pieces, whatever size they are, relative to a grain line. And by grain line here on this mat, I mean relative to the straight edges of the mat. I prefer my scraps to not look like they had a hard night of drinking. In the case of the Fusi knit, once I anchor the base with pins, fusible side up, onto the cutting board, I use a ruler and a Chaco liner or colored pencil to draw a grid, though the grid on the cutting board, if you can see through the Fusi knit, can be really helpful as well. Next comes the fun part. This is where you get to start placing scraps and get a sense for how they work together. Light value is important. Whenever you have a scrap that is markedly different in value from the others, that is very, very light or very, very dark compared to the others, it will be the focus. If you are creating a garment, make sure that that focus isn't over a critical body part. For example, the bust point. I like to think in terms of 3, like I did in these 2 mats. Squinting at the composition takes out color or hue, an old trick we learned in art school, and it shows you value. You can also take a photo with your cell phone in grayscale. I look for a continuity and a composition that moves your eye around the piece. Once you are fairly confident with what goes where, it's time to trim and get all the pieces perfectly aligned. Peek at the grid underneath if you're using one. Make sure pieces are parallel to a grid line, and carefully trim away any fabric that overlaps another fabric. This creates a smooth surface with no bulk. Each scrap should butt exactly next to each other with no gap or overlap. This part can be tedious. Take away small amounts at a time. I should mention that if you are creating a tote bag and using the Peltex 71 as the base, it's important that as you lay the scraps on the Peltex, they extend over the borders of the Peltex by a good 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters. When I cut the base for a tote bag, there are no seam allowances since the Peltex is too stiff to create seams. So I extended the scrap pieces and they become the seam allowances. Once you're happy with your finished composition, it's time to fuse everything down. In the case with the firm base, like Peltex or Pellon's Thermolam Plus Fusible, the entire thing can be carried to the ironing board. If you're working with Fusi knit as a base, carry the entire cutting board, if possible, to the ironing board, or better yet, bring the iron to the cardboard cutting board. I should just mention this as a word of caution. If you used a rotary cutting board to anchor all the pieces, because some of them are pinnable, you can't iron or fuse directly onto what you're working on, as that heat will warp your rotary cutting mat and it'll ruin it. I have a rotary cutting mat on my cutting table. So to protect it, I've put a thick folded towel underneath the cardboard cutting board. For the stiff bases, you can only fuse from the fabric side. Try a scrap first to check that the iron is hot enough to get the fabric to fuse, but not so hot that it will damage the fabric. I use a piece of silk organza as a press cloth. Anything heavier won't allow the heat to really penetrate and you won't get a good fuse. You'll need 2 ingredients for a proper fuse besides heat: pressure and time. Push down with the iron and hold for at least 15 seconds. Some irons will shut off if held in that position for that long. It's a good safety feature, I suppose, but I wouldn't have that type of iron in my studio. It'll shut off in the middle of fusing. I've mentioned this in previous videos. My studio iron is a gravity-fed industrial iron which has weight, a consistent thermostat, and a separate steam function. But that iron sits behind the camera. So for video purposes, I'll try to simulate this with my trusty old Proctor Silex. For the fusing knit, getting the pieces to fuse is much easier. You only have to get them to hold enough to remove the anchor pins and flip the section over and fuse properly from the back. Once everything is securely fused to the backing, it is time to cover all the butt joints with bias strips. Next time, we will learn how to create bias tubes and apply them. I'm Daryl Lancaster for The Weaver Sews.